Hey everyone, welcome to Starship Talks. Let's talk about the future of coding. The future of coding is that there will be a lot more people coding and a ton more code. A lot of it written by the AI. And with today's tools, that future will be a mess. But with the right tools, this can be the most sustained period of human advancement in history. And we think the right tools include a code intelligence platform that has three things. One is the graph of code. That means all the relevant code plus data on code navigation, the dependency graph, code ownership, runtime, logging, tracing, deployment, and any other kind of information about code. Two are the large language models whose general intuition gets augmented with specific and relevant data from that code graph. And that powers the third part, the workflows. The things that actually help devs write a new feature faster, fix bugs or vulnerabilities faster, and do refactors and migrations faster. Today, we're going to talk with the people behind the most important companies and projects building the graph of code intelligence and the large language models that will bring about this good kind of future for coding. First up, we have Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, whose LLM we've been building with. Next, we have Erica Brescia, formerly the COO at GitHub and now at Redpoint Ventures. Then, Simon Marlow, who's one of the code intelligence leaders at Meta. And finally, David Sachs, who's on the Sourcegraph board and is at Craft Ventures. Thanks for joining us. Let's get into it. First up, we have Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, one of the leaders in the LLM revolution and the creators of Claude, the AI model that we're building with at Sourcegraph. Dario will talk to my co-founder and CTO Beyang Liu about LLMs and their future, how they will get smarter for everyone, and in particular, for developers and people in other specialized domains.
All right, I'm here with Dario Amodei, the CEO and co-founder of Anthropic. Dario, how's it going?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being an awesome early partner as we build Cody, Sourcegraph's kind of first foray into the intersection of developer tools and large language models. Very excited to chat with you as you and your company have been at the forefront of spearheading and pushing the frontier of artificial intelligence. First thing I wanted to ask is to tell us a little bit about your backstory. So what was kind of the background behind founding Anthropic, and what was your motivation in starting this company?
Yeah, so we were, before Anthropic, I and many of my co-founders were at OpenAI for 5 years. We built the safety team there and also built the GPT-2 and GPT-3. And yeah, we basically had a vision of, a combination of kind of scaling these models and making them safe, both in the short term and in the long term. And we really see kind of empirical work on how to make the models more safe and more steerable as kind of essential to that. And, in the long run, it helps us to get into kind of a better place in terms of AI and broader society. And I think, in the short run, it has a number of practically helpful features that make the models more usable.
Yeah, I think that was for many years a big complaint about some of the neural network based models, that they were difficult to understand and analyze. When they screwed up, it was hard to kind of introspect and debug. And as you kind of look at it on the competitive landscape that's emerging now, do you see this as kind of like a continuing source of differentiation for Anthropic? Like, is that still part of your core value proposition? Like more safe, more steerable?
I think there's kind of always something new and always a better way to do it, and always new problems. So I think if I think about where the field is going, like I think the field has made I think a fair amount of progress on like what we call harmlessness, which is making sure that models don't assist in violent activities or say various things that are bad. Right. I think models still struggle with making things up, with the problem that's been called hallucinations. Yep. And also just making the process of getting these models to do what people want them to do. There's always something new, right? So 3 months ago we came out with this thing called constitutional AI, and so the idea is constitutional AI. You can make a 1 or 2 page document. We kind of called it a constitution, where you list some kind of principles or values that the AI system will follow, and then you can train a model to follow that particular constitution. So different applications like, a developer tool versus a legal use case versus a customer service use case, they all kind of require different model behaviors, just as human professionals in those positions have kind of different need for knowledge and different expectations around how they do their job. So, on top of the existing methods, that's like a new way to interact with systems. And so we're always trying to refine those and to develop new ones and get to a point where, the models are more reliable, more safe, do more what humans want them to do. And so it's kind of a continuing problem, and one that has to keep up with the models getting more powerful and having broader scope.
Makes total sense. I think, taking a step back a bit, one of the things that has been difficult for many folks, including myself, to kind of grasp is like how exactly these models work underneath the hood in the first place. I mean, there's kind of a range of interpretation. On the one end of the spectrum, people are like, oh, this is the precursor to AGI, or it's like almost sentient. And on the other and it's, people are saying like, oh, it's just glorified autocomplete or text completion. What is your kind of like explain it like I'm five for like what language models are doing?
Yeah, so the explain it like I'm five is we still have very little idea. We're starting to get better at it, and indeed, one of the areas that Anthropic has put the most effort into is an area called interpretability, where we literally try and look inside the matrices, the weights of the model, and understand what they're doing. Do they form these various circuits? But it's very early in that, right? We've identified some principles, but all of this is it's very far from being able to be applied to a to today's deployed models, let alone ones that are further out. So this is a very active area of research for us, but in many ways we still don't know what's going on inside them, and that's been one of our concerns, and is a separate direction from kind of trying to steer and direct the models, is trying to understand what's going on inside them. So I think those two dual problems have been two that Anthropic's working on. The first, I think, has direct applications for deploying models. The second is on a substantially longer arc, but we're working to make it relevant as fast as we can.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you foresee in the future having some sort of explainability API of sorts? Like if you're trying to reason about how a model got to the response that it created, is that something that you would want to expose to the API consumer or the end user?
That's not going to happen tomorrow. I think it might not even happen next year, but I think that would be the hope, to really, and there are limits to understanding, right? Ultimately, reasoning processes are super complicated and super implicit, but it feels like there are cases where you may be able to track down, hey, there are several different reasons a model could have given the response it did. For example, did it memorize this response? Is it relying on a stereotype? Did it reason from first principles? And I'm optimistic about someday being able to make those kinds of determinations. But I emphasize that's pretty far out. Like, in terms of LLMs and applications, interpretability is behind in the sense that, it's probably like, 2 or 3 research breakthroughs away from even having that commercial relevance. But because we think it's such an important problem, we want to get to that point as fast as we can.
Fascinating. What is your kind of evaluation of the emerging landscape of language models? There's Anthropic, there's a couple of kind of proprietary players in the space. You got OpenAI, Cohere, Google is getting into the game now. Facebook is releasing open source models. There's also open source models coming out on Hugging Face. What is kind of your maybe like 10,000 foot overview of what the landscape is going to look like, and where is Anthropic going to fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the efforts to produce these models and deploy them in the world are moving incredibly fast, right? We've seen that in the last 3 months, and frankly, over the last 2 years, I was kind of surprised at how slow things were moving, or kind of appeared to be moving. After GPT-3, I was like, look, these things are just going to continue scaling up. They're going to get better. There's going to be a crazy explosion.
Yeah,
and the actual thing that happened was really weird. It was kind of like, there was not too much that happened for I don't know, like 2021 and 2022. And then in the last 3 months, there's this giant explosion. It feels like we've had that exponential was there in the background, but but the last 2 years of exponential have all been caught, like a video that's been poorly buffered. It's all caught up in the last 3 months.
Yep.
So I think things are going pretty fast, and one hope I would have is kind of races can happen in different ways, and something I would hope for is that instead of one worry here is we have a race to the bottom where everyone's kind of trying to release these as fast as possible without thinking about the consequences. But it would be great to have, and I think we're starting to see some signs of it, a race to the top where folks are trying to make these models safer, steerable, more reliable, to characterize them better. And so Anthropic, in terms of its position in the ecosystem, often thinks of itself as a player that's kind of basically trying to push things in that direction, right? Trying to push folks to compete to be more responsible rather than to compete to be less responsible. And I think ultimately that's good for the users of the model. In the long run, that's good for humanity. So that I don't know. That's kind of our perspective on this. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the technologies, while complex, there's no rocket science to building them, and so I think they are going to be everywhere.
Awesome. What do you think the implications are for information retrieval, or to put it more bluntly, is are search engines dead in the age of AI?
Yeah, I mean, I feel one thing I've realized, I've been a researcher most of my life and have only run a company for the last couple of years, and one of the things I've realized is technical things like if I train a language model, twice as big and for twice as many tokens, it's very predictable, what capabilities will come out of that. But when you say like, how will consumers interact with these things? How will businesses interact? Is X business dead? Is it going to be replaced by Y? I find that second class of things very hard to predict. And I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who's that good at predicting them, because there's some inherent uncertainty to them. I mean, if we look at being in Sydney and what Google is trying to do with search, and there are several search startups we work with. We work with DuckDuckGo, for instance, that they're trying a different way of adding language models to their search than Bing is. I don't know what Google is ultimately going to do, but several different approaches are going to be tried. And so my guess would be search isn't dead, but it's the shape of it is changing in some way that's hard to anticipate. And we're going to have a few different experiments, and some of them are going to work out better than others. And kind of the system, the economy will kind of work out what actually works and what doesn't.
Makes total sense. To kind of dive into the technical weeds just a little bit here. So thus far, it seems to me that the dominant model of combining search and language models is to use this kind of embeddings-based retrieval, and then to take the relevant snippets and kind of put those into the context window of the model, and then ask for the most relevant result, or for the language model to produce an answer based on the context. I've also seen papers where people are, first of all, finding ways to expand the context window, scale attention past the kind of quadratic limitation that naive attention has, and there's kind of the retro-based models too that supposedly have an effective context window of millions of tokens. Do you think that the dominant model of the current model of using embeddings, nearest neighbor search, and fetching that into the context window will remain a thing, or do you think it's going to evolve towards more of these integrated approaches where we're relying on the attention mechanism or the model itself to do the information fetching?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's all kind of, in a way, it's all a little bit on the same spectrum, where they're all versions of the idea where, okay, I have my model, it's been trained on general knowledge, and then I have a bunch of additional information that I want to incorporate. And it kind of goes from, the simplest ways to incorporate that information to ways to incorporate that information that rely on the intelligence of the language model. And there's a spectrum between that. On one end, it's just just do a nearest neighbor search, or just use Google or an internal search tool to dig up some documents, and then and then the model can also search over that document. And in a way, that's just a different version of prompting your model.
Yeah.
Embeddings are kind of a way to kind of do nearest neighbor search on something that uses the intelligence of the model on the input, but doesn't think about the specific situation. And then you could imagine as you mentioned, with this retro paper, which is a way of using
Yeah.
the model to directly retrieve a more integrated way to do the same thing. So again, I feel like all of these are going to be tried, and I think ultimately it'll come down to how much better are the more sophisticated ones than the simpler ones,
Right.
and what do you pay for them? How much does it cost in inference? How much of a pain is it to serve? And of course, bringing it back to Sourcegraph, in the case of you guys, in terms of making code tools and developer tools, right? This is a very germane question for you guys, right? Where you have a repo, or you just may want to search over some larger set of some larger set of code bases that and so I think you guys are going to be at the forefront of kind of experimenting with what works best in this area.
Yeah. So up until now, I think most of the language model providers have been offering kind of language models as like foundational building blocks. Like they're a piece of, that you can depend on. The language model is kind of like self-contained, and some other system can invoke it as like a subcomponent. But there's also been a lot of discussion about having language models be orchestrators of these other systems. Having these kind of like different information sources or context sources that the language model can call out to. Do you think that in the next 12 months, we will see like a large model provider release an API that actually does more of that orchestration, where it's not just, Sourcegraph calling out to Claude, but maybe Claude can now, do searches in Sourcegraph to answer a user query as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a like a very broad view of this, like one way you can think of language models is, they're a little bit like the unaided human brain, or maybe even like a disembodied brain, right? Where you can teach, you train them and they start to get good at like writing code, but they've never actually interacted with an interpreter. They're good at adding, at like doing arithmetic, but they're not that good. Just like a human, if you ask them to add 7-digit numbers, they don't necessarily always get right. But of course, there are these tools called calculators that would enable you to always get it right. And if you ask them to reserve a restaurant for you, well, they can't actually do that because they're not connected to the internet, but they know what website to go to, and they know that they know what they would do on OpenTable if you ask them to reserve it, and what restaurants to search for. And so it almost feels like they're kind of like a brain looking for a body, right? And so I definitely think we're going to add all of these external tools, and the models will kind of glom onto those tools fairly easily and learn and learn to use them. So I would expect that to be something very substantial that's done. One thing I want to call out is, I said before that, safety problems aren't solved, right? There's still more differentiation in this area. So once you start to use external tools, I feel like that brings up a new set of safety issues, because the models are then taking actions on your behalf and changing the world in ways that you may not observe, on your operating system, on the web, taking action that gets felt on some other continent. And so we need to make sure that the models do what you want them to do, but aren't taking some bad or unaccountable action on your behalf. So I think that's all to say. I think this is definitely going to happen, but brings a new set of safety issues to worry about.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The prompt injection stakes become much higher when these models can actually impact the world and have mutation capabilities. So as far as developer tools are concerned, we're seeing like all sorts of companies pop up right now that are making use of language models in really interesting ways. What are the ones that you're most excited about, and what do you want for yourself or your own team? Like, what do you think will amplify the productivity of your own development team the most?
Yeah. So I guess what you mean is like tools for writing code, right? Like what Sourcegraph does, and
writing code or reading code.
Does writing code, reading code. I just think there's kind of so much in this area, right? Where just a year or two we were in the autocomplete world of that was the main codex, that was the main tool that was available, but that models are able to conversationally discuss code. I feel like that opens up so many possibilities. Feels like there's so many things, like you can have a model explain code to you. Again, we have to get the reliability up. If it's right 80% of the time, it's probably not worth it, but increasingly getting the reliability up there. Explaining code, summarizing code, finding bugs in code, translating code from one language to another. I think there's a huge amount of overhang here. And I also think that this is an area where progress will be fast. And I think it's going to be for a technical reason, which relates to training models and relates to this external tools thing that you talked about, which is when you talk to your model conversationally in natural language, there's no way to know for sure whether the answer was correct or not. A human can rate it. But with code, there can be this loop where, at least to some extent, you can say, oh, did the model pass the unit test or not? So all the kind of standard automated tools of like code coverage, unit tests, kind of linters, like every kind of non-AI tool that's been developed can now be combined or integrated in some way in many different ways, right? And so there's so many combinations here that I'm super excited to see where it all goes. And again, to make the safety point, like models running code similarly to models like taking actions on the internet that have distant consequences is something we need to make sure that it's that these things are secure, that they run in sandboxes, that the code that they write doesn't have vulnerabilities that we don't anticipate. So that again with the theme that like as the models get more expansive, these new issues come up, and we'll have to hopefully we can deal with these issues before we deploy this the new generation of models.
Makes total sense. What do you think language models do to the value of data, and specifically proprietary data? I've seen a lot of commentary about how companies should be building up, like every company should be building up like a proprietary data set right now, because data becomes more valuable, and we're going to see the open source data quickly be assimilated into all the language models that are available. Do you think it's important for companies to think about the proprietary data that they have access to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super complicated question that kind of varies a lot, right? Like lots of things that are available, lots of things that you might consider proprietary data in a lot of cases, might just be available on the open web. But I think in other cases there is something, there are actual pieces of information that you can get proprietary data that you couldn't get anywhere else. So I guess I would think about it from a very human lens, right? People talk about how much data can we get to train our models. Well, we might run out at some point, but there's a whole bunch of open data. And so in terms of the value of proprietary data, I think about like knowledge that's specific to the situation and knowledge that isn't knowledge that isn't available anywhere else. And I think those are the two things that are going to have value. I think one way that I wouldn't quite call it proprietary data, but like it relates back to this thing you talked about with like embeddings and retro style models, which is that if I ask a model like Claude a question, it has a lot of general knowledge, but it would be great if I could ask the model a question like I would ask a coworker, and both me and the coworker have a lot of information about the organization that we work at and the specific situation that we're in. So a lot of internal data that companies have could be used to could be used to deploy models that are specific to the internal data. And again, you can imagine this applying to Sourcegraph and its customers. So that would be use for just one particular company. But I think there's so much around making the model custom and specific and knowing the situation, because I think more than models getting smarter, that actually might be missing more, like context and awareness of the situation.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Last question, can I get you to opine on what the future roadmap looks like for Claude and Anthropic? We're coming on the heels of a very big week in AI, last week with the release of GPT-4 and a lot of other interesting models. Is Anthropic coming out with new models? Are you going to go the multimodal path? Are you going to have larger context windows? What's kind of the path forward for you over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a number of kind of directions in terms of at some point we're gonna release a Claude 2, and again we're continuing to train the models, certainly to keep scaling them, but I think more than that, especially to focus on this like helpful, honest, harmless stuff. I still feel like getting the trade-off right, where the models do the things people want them to do, they don't do bad things, but at the same time, they don't kind of refuse to do things that are just fine in kind of a silly way.
Yeah.
Making sure that the models can really be relied on not to make things up. I think that is super important in a number of contexts. Like, I think certain kinds of customers and companies are extremely freaked out with good reason by the idea that the model would just make something up. I mean, imagine, again, like I would use like a medical or a legal setting for this. Like,
Yeah.
if it's like, okay, my doctor, they're just, they'll give you a diagnosis, but 20% of the time they just make something up. That's just
Yep.
not, obviously not acceptable.
Yep.
So I think working on, the honest and the helpful, honest, harmless is a big priority. In terms of kind of these other auxiliary tools, I mean, our roadmap there is very much driven by, where are kind of the interesting safety problems. As I alluded to, a couple times before, it's, new capabilities bring new issues. And so it's almost like where we choose to build the new capabilities determined by where we think there's a safety problem that's interesting enough that it's not trivial, but that we also think we can solve in time to deploy the model.
Makes sense.
So in this way, we're very driven by the safety issues, both because we think they're the most important, and practically speaking, they're blockers to adoption as well.
Makes total sense. Dario, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And thank you for being such a great partner.
Next up is Erica Brescia. Erica was formerly the COO at GitHub, and now she's at Redpoint Ventures, one of Sourcegraph's investors and an investor in many other amazing dev companies. I personally find Erica to be incredibly energizing about building a strong business that includes both engineers and customers. And I'm going to talk with her about how to do just that, how to bring engineers really close to the business and the customer. So Erica, you've been tremendously helpful to us at Sourcegraph. And I remember some meetings where we sat with you, we learned from you for 2 hours. We all walked out being so energized, and in particular about how you brought engineers closer to the business and customers, and how you brought the sales team closer to engineers. So we'd love to learn about how you built up that ability to do that so well. If you could just walk us through your history and learning to be good at that.
Yeah, and thanks for the kind words. Of course, I came out of that meeting thinking of all the things I didn't say or could have said better. So it's great to hear that it was useful for you folks. If I kind of go back in time, right, I was a startup founder, then I was at GitHub. In the early days of Bitnami, I think it really even goes back to a couple of our core values of the company. We had 5 core values, and one of them was ask why, and another one was like stay curious, right? And we would actually screen people at the time of hiring who really wanted to understand our business, who had curious minds, were not afraid to question like why things were the way they were. And that formed a really important, I think, foundation within the company that we were then able to build on in terms of understanding different parts of the business and sharing information. There are 2 concrete things that I would point to that I think really helped us out. One of them is, we would do these all hands every 2 weeks. And we made sure in the all hands to have different parts of the company presenting. And it wasn't always just product. Of course, everybody loves to see the product demos and hear from the engineers, but we would also have, BD or sales present and talk about recent customer wins or learnings or lost deals and what we learned from those. And we would even have like the finance team sometimes do a little segment on things that were changing about our processes or how we were making the way that we ran the business more efficient, or why we were changing a policy or something. And I think, elevating the different parts of the business and helping people build some empathy and some context for why things were the way they were made change management easier than it otherwise would have been. And, it's not usually that hard at a small company, but certainly as we grew and then as we got to GitHub scale, that becomes more and more important. And then one other concrete thing is when we would get the company together for we called them on-sites because even back then we had a distributed team. We would make sure that there was a lot of time in our on-site schedule for sessions on various parts of the business, right? And so every single function within the company would do a quick presentation on like, what were their OKRs? How did they, achieve or not achieve them? And most importantly, like, what were the lessons learned and what are they looking to change for the next, quarter or half to improve the way they operate and, hit that kind of next set of goals. And I think, sometimes some people are more interested in certain parts of the business than others. But really investing that time, again, I think builds a lot of empathy and context. And then we also would make sure we planned a lot of activities for people to just build relationships with each other outside of work. At our on-sites, we would have a soccer game. I would lead a walking tour around Sevilla that became a joke because I'm a terrible tour guide, but like to walk really fast. But I think, those types of things and just helping people know who is working on what and who to reach out to help a lot. And, even when you kind of fast forward to GitHub, we at our all hands would always have a section where we had the sales team present, and we had like a WinWires channel where we would talk about customer wins and learnings.
That's awesome.
And again, really try to highlight different parts of the company. We had support talk about the improvements they were making in support and how they were improving CSAT and how they were automating things. It takes a lot of deliberate action and time invested, but I think it pays dividends, in particular when you're running a remote and distributed team. Is there anything that folks are doing at Sourcegraph that you think has been working well on that front?
Well, we love having our own devs go and work with the devs at customers. Our customers are devs, so in a sense, you could say it's easier. But we're talking about dev tools companies here, and there are some devs who think, oh well, what are the rules that I need to follow? How do I need to behave? Do I need to speak in formal language? And once they realize it's just a dev on the other side, someone just like them, that just takes a whole barrier down. And people come back with these amazing stories about, oh, I didn't realize that this was so painful in the product, and I just got motivated to go and improve it. And it's so inspiring to me as CEO. And one thing we've gotten a lot better at is doing precisely that with with our new head of engineering. He's done an amazing job of this. And so for me as CEO and founder for the last 10 years, I look back to the previous time in which that I had tried to instill that better. But you kind of got a chance to do that when you came into GitHub, having done that at Bitnami previously. So what did you feel like you needed to adjust in terms of engineers getting close to customers when you got to GitHub? What could be improved?
When it comes specifically to engineering and sales, which is always like I think a more challenging relationship, there's a few different aspects to it, right? One is the concept of sales, and like customers can kind of make engineers nervous if they're not used to having that kind of exposure. And to your point, once they start talking to people and realize, oh, wait, this is just a conversation where I'm trying to solve a problem for somebody and see if like what we're building will solve it. You see this like aha moment, and they're like, oh, wait, this isn't that bad. These people are, I'm in a position to help them. And if I listen to them, I can make the product better. Right. And I think just building that muscle, I think what changes from a smaller company to a company like GitHub is you just have to be a lot more programmatic in like building in the expectation that people do this work and having a way for people to engage. Like we pulled a lot of engineering folks into support at GitHub. In particular, when I first got there, our support team was really struggling for a wide variety of reasons that I won't get into, but like our CSAT was really low, and we just, the company and the business had grown so much, we weren't actually adequately staffed at the time, and just didn't have efficient enough processes to be able to support the customer base that we had that was growing so quickly. And if you look at a company like Bitnami, it was pretty easy. Like we used to rotate engineers through support. I'll come back to sales in a minute, but we used to rotate engineers through support because it built in that empathy and that understanding of what needed to be fixed in the product. And it actually resulted in a much better product. When you're GitHub scale and you have, 500-600 or more engineers, you need to build like really clear kind of channels and processes for bringing engineers into, whether it's, customer calls on the sales side or on the support side. And one thing we learned was how support needed to have a method for like identifying the cases that engineers could actually work on and help resolve, and like the product fixes that, that could happen quickly, basically, and surface up like a prioritized list of cases that we could then kind of hand to engineers. So we needed like a PM to go in, understand, the scope of the open tickets, understand what work needed to be done as a result, like kind of prioritize that and make it easier for the engineers who raise their hand. In the case of support, we asked for volunteers to actually engage. Support hadn't really built that out initially, and they just raised their hands like, hey, help. Then the engineers got there and didn't know what to do or how to help. So I think, at a small company, you can kind of get away with, a few Slack convos here and there, and like you can kind of understand what to do. At a bigger company, you need like kind of a program and a plan and a process for engaging people with the work. And the same goes for sales, right? Like what engineers, like some people really just don't want to be in front of customers, full stop. And, some companies choose to be deliberate in their culture and that, no, you're all going to talk to customers. And that's the way we're building the company, which I think is great. Not every company does that. And not every company can do it when you get to scale of, hundreds and hundreds of engineers. And so part of it was identifying like who is going to be energized by this and will be able to productively engage and wants to do that. And then also it's, how do you take the insights that you get from those phone calls and package them up in a way that can help actually inform the product roadmap, right? Again, at a startup, things happen a lot more organically, and it's only as you mature that you get a much like further out product roadmap and vision where you can like commit to things in advance in many cases. Of course, at GitHub scale, that becomes very important for your enterprise customers. And so you have to have this balance between, I heard this on a sales call versus, hey, what's actually going to move the business and what are we going to implement? Because we can't do it all at once. And you need better processes in place for ingesting, organizing, and then prioritizing that information so it gets turned into actual work to be done by the engineer.
Yeah. So when you found these engineer champions who wanted to go and be on the front lines, work with customers, the first ones that raised their hand to do that, what got them motivated? And, you could say a lot of engineers would say, well, I don't know how that's going to help me become a better engineer, but what is in it for engineers? What does it do to their career path? Anything beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak to everybody's individual motivations, but what I'll say is many times people get pulled in at first as somebody in sales or solutions architect or whatever is asking for a favor, right? Like, hey, pretty please, my friend who's in engineering, will you like come and hop on this phone call? And then they do it and they're like, holy cow, that was really cool, right? Once they start to see it, because I think, as an engineer in some companies, you can become somewhat separated from the customer if you're not careful and if the company is not deliberate about bringing these customer stories forward. And, I think for many people, it's very rewarding to see how the work you're doing is actually benefiting somebody, and not just in this kind of vague storytelling way, but no, I'm on the phone with a user whose life has been made better because of something that I am working on. Like that's hugely motivating for most
Yeah.
people. And you use the word energizing, which is a word I love. Like, it can be very energizing and motivating to hear these stories and see the impact of your work. And I think great engineers have curious minds, and a curious mind hopefully wants to understand the impact of not just what they're building, but like the decisions that they're making and how they build it, right? Like,
Yeah.
hey, if I'm making this trade-off between speed and, some feature or something, like, how would my user think about the trade-off that I'm making? Like, am I making the right trade-off? And the more you can empathize with the customer's experience and using the product and how it helps or hinders their work, like, the better product you can build. So I think that's the motivation piece. On the career piece, I would say, understanding your customer and building that empathy will help you build a better product, full stop, which will generally help you in your career in general, right? I talked about making better decisions because you understand these things. I think that's true. I will also say, in every company that I've ever been in, these people grow within the business over time that have exposure and understanding of the different parts of the business and have context on how they fit together. And those end up being the people that you tap for like the critically important projects, right? Something comes up and you're like, I'll give you an example from GitHub. We had to re-engineer our entire data systems and our billing architecture, right? For some changes we wanted to make to our pricing model, which was a beast of a job. This was going to be an over a year-long project, touch almost every aspect of the business, right? This was something we were running out of my kind of office. And
I bet customers cared a lot about that.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're doing a project like that, you go through the company and you're like, I'm looking for the very best people in each function that I can pull together into a tiger team that understand enough about the other parts of the business to help make good decisions for the better of all of GitHub in that case, right? As opposed to just being kind of myopically focused on their role as an engineer or their role as a, finance person. And so I think, investing your time as an engineer and understanding different parts of the business ends up surfacing opportunities to get involved in these really critical cross-company projects, which elevate your visibility with the executive team in a bigger company and really kind of pave the path to promotions and just more optionality in your career in the event that, you want to add something on to that engineering skill set. Maybe you want to go into product, maybe you want to go into solutions architecture, right? The more you understand about the business, the more options you have.
So if you're one of those engineers who does want to be tapped for the super important project and grow and learn in all these ways, but you feel like your current company is not giving you those opportunities, what would you recommend to that person to do? What could they reach out to their COO or CEO or whatever and say?
I'm highly biased having been that COO, but anytime somebody reached out to me and expressed an interest to work on a project that we had ongoing and, everything was public, so people could kind of see a lot of the work that was happening both out of my office and like across the entire company. And anytime somebody reached out, like I immediately had this like note in my brain for when things came up again. Now, of course, I was always looking for people that were already doing a great job in their current role. So I think that's important to understand. Sometimes people reach out, but they're not actually exceptional in their core role. Either you're in the wrong role in that case, or you should be more focused on just doing that job first before you start looking at other things. If you think you're in the wrong role, then talk to your manager, and you can also talk to an HR person. But usually a manager is a good start to help you think about, hey, like, what skills do you see? What am I great at? Like, where might I apply these in the rest of the business?
So, make it so that if the CEO or COO reaches out to your manager, then they hear amazing things. They see this person is doing amazing, and it would be a huge loss to our team for them to help with this. That's what you wanted to hear, rather than well, we've been looking for this person's role, because then, you'd be taking on the burden of managing this person essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. You want people who are stellar performers. And, something that I think is really underrated in business in general, engineering or otherwise, is do what you say you're going to do and like deliver on time. And if you can't, because sometimes engineering tasks in particular take longer than expected, be really proactive in communicating that, right? And let people know constantly, reset expectations if you have to. But I think, just delivering and communicating are underappreciated skills that will also help you earn opportunities like the ones that we're talking about in cross-company projects, because executives notice when people deliver and like keep you posted on what's going on and help make sure that everybody has the information they need at the time that they need it. So that's a great way to stand out. And if you couple that with raising your hand and saying, hey, I've heard this project is going on, or I've seen this issue in the business and I have an idea of how to solve it. That happened a good amount at GitHub. People, in fact, that's how we formed our corporate security team. I was talking with one of the guys who ran our cert function, and he mentioned a few things that like he thought we were underinvested in. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Can you like write up a one-pager? And it was illuminating for me, a bunch of things I didn't know. I was fairly new in the business at the time. And we like funded an entirely new team and department and ran a bunch of work that he ended up spearheading because he took the initiative to do that. And he was a stellar performer in his existing role, who was a great communicator and everything else. So that opened.
That's awesome.
I mean, now he's the strategic advisor to the CISO at GitHub. So it opened up like an amazing, several steps in his career path as a result of his doing that. It's an awesome story.
Yeah, that's great. One other source of tension between sales and marketing on one side and engineers on the other is when it comes to what to make free or put in open source or do for the open source community, or to not annoy devs versus, how do we make money on a feature? What kind of principles or tactics did you use to make the right decision there?
Yeah. I mean, GitHub's model, especially the initial model, was great, right? And if you have an angle like that, it's fabulous, which is like everything that's public is free. If you want to keep anything private, you pay for it. It's a very clear line. It's very easy to understand. I think not all businesses have that opportunity, but anytime that you have an opportunity to make something very clear, like, here's a line, it's very simple, one side free, one side not, is great. I think in reality, for most businesses, that clear line is not there. And so there are, I think, a pretty standard set of things and features that are really more appropriate for enterprise. And, the things we look at are, number one, scale, right? If you're running an infrastructure company, like, yeah, maybe you have a free tier, but it should really just be meant for prototyping. As soon as somebody wants to put something in production, it's fair to charge them for it. So that's always kind of a line that we have in mind. I think, if you look at tools or products like Sourcegraph, it's like, hey, look, when do you go from like an individual user getting value out of something to a team? That's another really good dividing line. And whether it's just, going from one team to many, for each business, I think that can be a little different, right? You want to have like a good product-led growth motion where you can get a little bit of early momentum around product adoption within an org. But as soon as you need any kind of like management controls, role-based access control is, huge and something that really only an enterprise needs. So you're usually fine to charge for that. Features like audit, like, controls, extra logging, things that people need for compliance are also a very clear, I think, dividing line between free and paid.
The GitHub way with a single dividing line sounds a lot simpler. So I think the advice is, if you can find that simple dividing line, adopt that, right?
Yeah, if you can find that line, adopt it. If not, look at scale and compliance, like scale / production use, compliance, and management tools. Those are the buckets.
Yeah. And then final question, one that's very near and dear to the hearts of every DevTools company, where our users are developers. Do you think that the massive advances in LLMs recently will 10 years from now mean there's more people writing code or less people writing code?
It's a great question. And I wish I had a crystal ball. What I will say is, I don't know if there's been a time, certainly in my lifetime, where we've seen such rapid technological advancement and such a massive sea change, right? And just the way that the world works and the way that we're going to interact with almost every aspect of technology in our lives is going to change. And I don't think it's going to take 10 years. I think it's, this is more of a 3 to 5 year thing. I mean, the pace is mind blowing. Even when we launched Copilot at GitHub, like, it was better than we expected. How often is it that you launch a product and it delivers with like better quality than you expect?
It always happens to me, of course. But
always at Sourcegraph. Sourcegraph is very special. I think the job of developers is going to change materially. I think it's going to be much more about how do we create new ways of doing things. It's going to be much more of the creative outputs as opposed to, kind of rewriting the same or similar code. Like, I think a lot of the tedious work is going to go away very quickly. And I think that's a great thing for developers. We already saw people doing this in manual ways with Stack Overflow or searching GitHub for open source or something. And now I think that's very automated. And I think, things like testing and code reviews are very quickly going to get much more automated, much like it's going to be AI generated for the most part. But I think there will still be a role for developers in how do we build the new ways of doing things? And then how do we think about, the user experience of interacting with something, and how do we craft something that's new and better and different? So, my son's 10, he's learning Python, he's loving coding. I think it's still a worthy pursuit, and certainly will be. The way devs spend their time will change, but the need for an engineering mindset and a builder mindset is not going to go away.
Yeah, and one that understands who they're building for and the customers.
Exactly. Yeah. Way to wrap it up on that note.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. And thank you for all the amazing things that you built, and also for being a supporter of Sourcegraph now that you're at Redpoint.
Very grateful for the opportunity to work with you folks. Thanks so much for this.
Thanks. All right. Next up is Simon Marlow from Meta. Simon leads Meta's code search and indexing team. And Meta, Facebook before that, was one of the very first companies to realize the importance of code intelligence in the hands of every single dev to be super effective. Our head of engineering, Steve Yegi, will speak with Simon about code intelligence.
All right. Hey, Simon. Good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, I figured we'd start off by you could do a brief intro and tell us a little bit about your role at Meta and some of the stuff you've been working on.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Simon Marlow. So I've been at Meta for just about 10 years, actually. I'm currently working on what we call the code search and indexing team at Meta. Our team deals with kind of systems and tools and so on that help developers find code and navigate code. And one of the main things we do is we deal with a system called Gleam, which is doing code indexing. So indexing information about all the code bases that we have in various different languages.
And what languages are the big ones for you guys?
Well, we have an awful lot of Hack, which is our version of PHP. We have lots of C++, Python, Flow, various other languages. I mean, I suppose those are the main ones. But there's always a long tail of languages as well in that we want to handle. In there's Objective-C, there's Java, of course. We've got a fair amount of Java, and then there are a long tail of languages beyond that.
And are you supporting a repo, a mono repo, or lots and lots of little repos, or a hybrid?
Well, we're moving more and more towards a mono repo. I think, we've talked a lot in the past externally about how we think a mono repo is a great way to manage your code, especially a large company like we have. And yeah, so we have a lot of our code in a mono repo internally, and that presents lots of challenges, I think, for doing code indexing and code intelligence. It presents as many challenges as probably as problems it solves in some sense, because you have a huge scale of languages and the amount of code that you need to index together to provide a consistent view for developers across the entire repo.
Well, let's talk about that. So I think that a lot of our listeners may not be super familiar with the kind of tooling that you're building, because I don't think that it exists at a lot of other companies, even though there's probably a need for it. So why don't you tell me a little bit about, broadly, how do you define code intelligence, and what does it mean at Meta? And, what are your sort of ambitions and the problem that you're solving here?
Yeah, so a few years ago, we looked at the problem and tried to find a general solution to a number of different use cases that we saw in this space. And I mean, the obvious one is code navigation. That's where you typically start from, is the idea that you want to be able to give developers the ability to go from some source code where there's some symbols to click on a symbol and go to its definition. That's one of the basic things that you want to do. But then you also want to find out for a given definition, what are all the places in the code base that reference this definition, that call this function or whatever. And that's a good starting point. But then there are a number of use cases that kind of follow on from that. So you've got things like code documentation, where you'd like to be able to, from the source code, generate some nice pages of documentation that are hyperlinked, that the developers can navigate around and give a nice sort of browsable way to view APIs and to navigate APIs separately from the source code. So that's one use case. And then you probably would like to be able to ask questions in general about information about your source code. Like, so you might be able to construct queries that let you extract information about the code. Like, find me all the ancestors of this class, or find me all the functions that this function calls transitively, or look at my build graph and find all the executables that reference this library, or there's a long list of questions that you would like to ask that involve information that's not directly manifest in the source code or in the build system.
Okay, but I mean, like, when I hear that, just kind of trying to channel, developers who haven't worked at Google or Facebook or Meta, isn't that an IDE? I mean, doesn't an IDE do everything that you just described?
I mean, it does some of those things for sure, right? So in your IDE, you can navigate around the code. You can see metadata, you can see outlines, and you have a number of features for sort of navigating code using the kind of data that we collect through indexing. But I mean, IDE doesn't typically give you easy access to analysis that does dead code analysis, for example, that finds all the functions in your code base that aren't referenced from somewhere. So I think it goes a long way beyond what you can typically do in an IDE. An IDE is one use case for some of this information, but often you want to collect a lot more information than the IDE uses, and there are use cases beyond what the IDE is providing. So I think it's part of really the whole ecosystem of tools that you want to give developers, and a lot of these tools need metadata about the source code. They need semantic information about the source code. And you need a system underlying that collects the information and provides you with a convenient way and a powerful way to query the information that you collected from the source code. And that leads to a number of different tools, of which the IDE is one, I think.
So isn't it also the case that IDEs don't really scale up to Meta's code base size?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big problems that we're trying to solve, especially in a mono repo. So, I mean, you're probably familiar with working in an IDE on a fairly small code base, where you open it and your IDE can index all your code on the fly on your local machine. But as soon as you have a huge stack or a mono repo of code where you can't realistically index the entire thing on one machine on your local laptop or whatever. Or maybe even, working in an open source world where you're working on one project and you're on top of a huge stack of libraries and systems that you use. And you'd really like to be able to navigate around all of that stuff with the full fidelity of information that you get for the project that you're working on. So one of the scaling problems that we're trying to solve is giving developers the full resolution of data about their project they're working on, but also across the entire repo, and as far as possible, giving them information about all of the other projects and all the other libraries and things they might be depending on throughout the mono repo, and providing a seamless experience when they navigate outside the project. So that's one of the problems.
Yeah, so we built back when I was at Google, we built something like this as well, and we ran into the same problems, right? Which is fundamentally that you want all of your IDE capabilities at scale, and they just the IDEs are very project centric. They're also fundamentally not scalable. And the thing that we noticed was that people kept coming in and they couldn't find their way around the code base, and so it was a difficult hump, I think, for people to get over, because it sure seemed like an IDE. But one of the things that I really loved about it, and you sort of hinted at this when you were talking about, the dependency graph and the build graph, is that these code intelligence platforms that you've built at Meta and that we built at Google, which can power, all sorts of tools. We'll talk about that in a bit. But one of the really cool use cases that it could do is it could tell you who you're going to break if you change something. Right? In other words, who depends on you, which an IDE won't do. An IDE tells you who you depend on, so that if one of them changes, your project will break appropriately and the IDE will complain about it, right? But if you're a library maintainer, how amazing is it to be able to go and say, I'm proposing a change to this library, and I want to know everybody across the entire company that's going to break because of it. And I want to be able to automatically manage pull requests that go out to these team members and maybe even suggest fixes for them. Yeah, when I do a big mass refactoring. Do you guys have something like that at Facebook?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this comes up in a couple of different ways. So one is the thing I already mentioned, where you're finding all the references for a symbol, going from a definition to all the places in the code base that reference it. And you can do that transitively. So you could find all of the transitive references of something. So that's at the sort of the code entity level, and then there's the same thing that comes up at the maybe the target level or build rule level. So through your build system, finding all of the entities in the build system that might reference something. So this is something that we handle in a kind of general way in Glean. The idea is that when you're collecting information about your language or your build system, you encode in Glean the facts that point from the usage to the definition of something. And then Glean can automatically derive the arrows in the opposite direction. And we call this derivation. So it happens in a sort of automatic step after you've collected all the information. So it derives all the arrows in the opposite direction. And then you can follow these arrows. So you have information about the definition going to all of the uses of it. And so on, and then you can follow those arrows recursively. So yeah, I mean, this is definitely something you get as an added value from having a system that's pre-computing or pre-collecting all of the metadata, and then you can derive additional data on top of that.
So you're getting all this information from basically compilers, right? Or from systems that are very compiler-like. I'm sure Hack and Flow both have, type checkers and things like that, right?
Yep.
So you have to run these compilers in a special mode. You're doing a special build of the code, right? That's how we did it at Google. We instrumented the build system to sort of not generate what you normally generate with your build. You don't generate the binaries and artifacts and jars or whatever. You're generating index artifacts as part of your build, right? You guys do it that way as well, yeah?
So it depends very much on the language. Each language or each compiler does this in a different way. And we haven't built in any particular mechanism for doing this in Glean. It's very much up to what we call the indexer. The indexer is the thing that looks at the source code and generates the facts, which is what we call them. The facts is the data that goes into Glean. So you build one of these for each of the languages that you want to index. And for example, for C++, we're just using the Clang library as a backend as a way to process the source code and give us the abstract syntax tree, the internal representation of the code that we can then process and walk over it and generate the data for Glean. That's for C++. And then for Python, there's a similar sort of thing called libcst that we use for doing that. And I think for Java, we have a compiler plugin that can do a similar sort of thing at compile time for Java. But whether you do it at compile time or by invoking a library or by a completely standalone tool that just processes the source code using a different library, it depends entirely on how you want to build these things. And we don't mandate any particular way of doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're doing the same work for every programming language, right? Effectively, you need to find, the cross references and the symbol declarations and, work your way through the call graph and all the other artifacts. Those things are all language independent by and large, right? So you're coming up with a language neutral representation.
Well, actually, so in Glean, we don't have a language neutral representation, at least not at first for each language. This is one of the design choices that we made in Glean, is that we think each language may have language specific use cases as well as language neutral use cases, and we want to support both of those things. The language neutral use cases are things like code navigation, the typical use case where you want to navigate around symbol definitions. But there are lots of language specific use cases as well. For example, in C++, we're doing we have an analysis to detect dead include statements, for example, and that relies very specifically on particular semantic aspects of the way C++ works. It depends on using declarations and weird things to do with how namespacing works and stuff like that. So we don't mandate any particular language neutral representation for the data we collect. Each language can collect data that's specific to the language, and then we abstract over that. So for each language, there's a mapping between the language specific data we collect and a language neutral representation of that. And again, that's a form of derivation. So it happens that we derive these additional facts from the original facts that we collected about the source code. That happens in a general way. You program all this in the what we call the schema layer in Glean. And for each language, you just do that separately, so we can provide language neutral information for all of the different languages that we support.
So you've got this team that's putting this in a tremendous amount of work to build what could be argued to be IDE-like functions and a set of even richer functions like static analysis. But for all employees of Meta, and it's a lot of work, right? It's ongoing maintenance because you have to maintain these indexers, which are very bespoke and very language specific, and they shovel that data from your nightly build or however often you're doing it into your Glean database. Well, do you ever feel like somebody ought to standardize that at some point?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. So I mean, just internally, the way we're trying to scale this is by not doing all the work ourselves as far as possible. We try to make it as platform-like as we can. So we provide a platform that people can build their own indexes. Other language teams throughout the company can build their own indexes on top of our platform.
Has that been successful?
And it's had some success. Let's say that it's had some success. Definitely, the core languages we're maintaining within our own team, because those tend to be the languages that we want to focus most effort on a continuous basis. And C++ is very much the one that tends to require the most effort, let's say. It's the most complex of all of the use cases.
That was absolutely true at Google as well, right?
Yeah.
The Kai team there told me recently that something like 50% of the artifacts in their schema are just there to support C++. So it's just this monster. Right,
our C++ schema is definitely the biggest and most complex of all of the schemas. But I mean, for this long tail of languages, we often don't have the effort available. I think going back to what you said previously about needing some kind of standardization, I think that's absolutely true. We would very much like to be able to piggyback off other people's efforts in building indexes and as far as possible, and having some kind of standard format for that would I think be a great improvement over the current situation.
Yeah, I think so. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the really, really cool use cases that you're enabling or that you can enable with your code intelligence platform that people might not be aware of?
Well, so I mentioned code documentation earlier on. That's one that we're quite actively working on at the moment. I mean, you've probably seen things like Doxygen and so on. Each language has their own sort of solution for doing this sort of thing. But there isn't really a language independent way of doing it. And that's something that we're trying to build internally, is a language independent way to do that. And it involves having indexes that collect enough information and then plumbing that through our language independent layer through to there's a sort of middleware service that we call Glass that takes all of this data and exposes it in a much simpler way to clients. So the
I just got to say, man, I am so jealous. I am so jealous that you guys did this, because we tried at Google. I had engineers on it. We were passionate about it, right? The universal doc system tied with the code, because your doc comments, they're part of your code. I mean, that becomes even clearer when you start training generative models, right?
Yeah.
And we never got it off the ground. We implemented like a V1 of it, and then we just couldn't. It's just a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. Getting all the details right is a tremendous amount of work, and that's very easy to underestimate. Making sure that you've got all of your function modifiers right for all of the different languages that you support, and there's a huge amount of detail that you have to do, and the way that we found that to do this that works is by working very closely with people who are intimately familiar with those languages and getting them to give us all the feedback about the things that are wrong, so that we can just keep fixing it until it's good enough. And we have to do that for each of the languages. So it is a huge amount of work, but it's so worthwhile. I think having access to online documentation that's accurate all of the time for your code base, and you can link to it from everywhere. So you quite often have wiki pages where you want to link directly to the documentation for some code, and just being able to have a well-defined URL for that remains correct all of the time is really great.
Yeah, and also that kind of information is really, really valuable for training models and as context for feeding LLMs. Speaking of which, let's talk a little bit. Let's close actually with how you think the future is unfolding for code intelligence. How do you see the intersection with AI?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously this is super interesting at the moment. AI has the potential to be a massive improvement for productivity for developers. But of course, there's a lot of challenges there as well. I mean, if you suddenly have a lot of AI generated code, is that just going to make it much easier to write all of the boilerplate? And then are we going to end up with a massive amount of boilerplate code that we didn't really want?
I mean, that's exactly what happened with IDEs in the mid 90s. Right? I remember when IDEs came out, and they were really good at generating boilerplate, and they generated so much that you needed IDEs to manage all the code they were generating. And I do actually think that we're in an analogous situation today. The AIs are going to make us so much more productive that you're going to need AI to manage the code that's getting generated. Right. But we've already shown with IDEs that was a net win. Yeah. So I'm not too worried about it. What about you?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I really want AI to tell me how to make a better API that doesn't need all of the boilerplate usage at all the usage sites.
Oh my goodness. Well, so that right there, I believe that might be the intersection that's the holy grail, right? If we can find a way to get that part of our code graph into the, get those facts right into the AI, then it can actually, I think it can be reasonably expected to tell you how to make a great API, for example.
Yeah, I think that would be amazing. But I think in the short term that there's some pretty clear benefits that we can get by using all of the data that we collect in these code indexing systems and using that as part of the training model for these models, and to give you more than you get just by looking at the text of the source code. I think there's a richness of data available that we're not really exploiting at the moment.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Well, hey, Simon, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today, and always awesome to compare notes. I think you and I might want to put our heads together and maybe look into this whole standardization thing. There might be some legs there.
Sounds great. Good to talk to you, Steve.
All right. Thanks, Simon. Simon, take care.
All right, let's close it out talking with David Sachs. David started Craft Ventures and formerly was the COO at PayPal and CEO at Yammer. Today, he's on the Sourcegraph board. I want this conversation to be like what I get if I call up David as a board member and ask him for advice, and he always gives real talk. So we'll be talking about how startups, how Sourcegraph, how every business should be changing and adapting as a result of this amazing new wave of AI technology. He'll draw on stuff that he saw from previous waves like cloud, mobile, and social, and how companies adapted well or should have adapted a little bit better. So here we go. Thanks for joining us. Sometimes other founders ask me, what is it like to have you on our board? And I say, you're tremendously helpful. You saw the promise in Sourcegraph early on. And also that sometimes it feels like you can get your own personal all-in podcast with David on just the things that matter to your own company. So that's my best selling point for you. So thanks for all of your support here at Sourcegraph so far.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about what you are seeing going on in the market and what you think is going to happen in the future with AI today, especially as it relates to SaaS companies. Mm-hmm. So, SaaS companies, they're either workflow companies or systems of record. Both of them seem to have huge potential to apply AI. So how are you seeing that right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're still just in the early stages of this, but I think it's a really exciting new technology wave. The history of Silicon Valley is these major waves that sort of stack on top of each other. And so, first you had obviously the internet. I mean, there's things even before that, but the internet in the late 90s is when I started getting involved. You kind of had Web 1.0. And then, in the sort of early 2000s, you started having new waves. You had social, and then you had, cloud and mobile, and they just kept unlocking new possibilities for startups to build on top of. And it's generally the case that startups do need a new wave to build on. This is sort of the why now question that VCs always ask, is why is your innovation now possible when it wasn't before? And as these waves get more mature, the good ideas start getting eaten up, and so you at some point you do need a new wave to come along to kind of unleash the potential of new startups. And that's what it seems like right now, is that again, the big waves previously were cloud, social, and mobile, and we've been kind of waiting for what the next one was going to be. I think there were a couple of possibilities that maybe were pretenders. I think crypto was and is very interesting, but it's sort of in its own category. It's not something that I think it's like really applicable to decentralized finance. I'm not sure it's like broadly applicable to business software.
Yeah.
And then you kind of had Web3, which is sort of crypto, but no one can quite understand what it means if it's not crypto or DeFi. So it's been a while since we had one of these waves, and now it seems like AI is that big wave. And sometimes I'm pretty skeptical of these things, but in this case, I'm actually pretty bullish because I've seen just early demos of the capabilities, and it seems very real to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing. If you go back to some of the other waves you mentioned, like cloud and mobile and social, you were running companies during a lot of those, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
Was it the same feeling that everything has changed?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what happens is that people recognize it at different speeds. And because in the early days, the adoption is still, it's still growing. And I think part of why VCs or Silicon Valley as a whole are always accused of being lemmings is because when something really promising comes along, they always want to be the first to embrace it. That's kind of their jobs. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. But on the whole, it's a good thing, right? Because it means that when something genuinely promising comes along, a lot of resources get thrown at it. And like you want that. That's the magic of Silicon Valley. And, people outside the industry are always making fun of the fact that like most of these things don't work out, but that's not really the point. I mean, the point is that some of these things work out spectacularly well. So
it's okay if you're a VC and you predict 10 of the last 5 waves.
Right.
That's still okay.
Well, you really don't want to miss the big one, basically, obviously it's better not to invest in a false hope, but it's pretty important not to miss like when the big wave does come along. And
So-
mobile, I remember was a pretty big deal. I mean, but even with mobile, it took a couple of years for everyone to realize how big a deal it was going to be, because you remember, there was a clear moment, which was the iPhone moment, right? Where Steve Jobs basically debuts the new iPhone, and, the early adopters could see how transformative and powerful it was, but Apple's market share was tiny at the time. So like people were still using BlackBerries and whatever. And so like in the first couple of years of mobile, there was a genuine debate among like forward-thinking people who got it. It's like, should we be building on iPhone or not? Because there are still hardly any users of it. And so you really have to be skating to where you thought the puck was going to go if you're going to build on it. Eventually everybody could see, once the market share numbers got there, like once there were, hundreds of millions of iPhone users, then it became obvious you should build for iOS and then Android. But in the early days, there was kind of this debate between, well, we see the potential, but is there enough of like a user base to build for? And nobody asked us. And that happens a lot in the early days.
Yeah. So you were CEO of VMware during some of these trends, during mobile and cloud. How was it being CEO during these and having to deal with the doubters, the haters, and also this feeling that if you don't shift the company, then you're going to be left in the dust?
Yeah. So I think we did some things right and some things wrong. I think the thing that we did right was that we were all in on cloud, or let's say that for us, that meant multi-tenant SaaS from the beginning, meaning that, and I think things have changed in this particular respect, because now you have, thanks to technologies like Docker and Kubernetes, you can actually deploy, self-hosted or on-prem versions, and it makes sense. But back, this would be like in, 2008, 2009, we basically went for a fully, again, multi-tenant SaaS, fully SaaS model. And it was really hard in the early days, because the number one objection that we got from prospects was not about our product. They wanted our product, but they were like, just burn it on a disk and give it to us. And we're like, sorry, we don't do that. We're only delivered through web. And so the biggest objection we had to the product wasn't even about us. It was just about the safety of the cloud. And you don't hear that as much anymore, meaning that I think cloud delivered software is viable in a way in which it just like, there are, I think now, companies that do want the self-hosted version, but nobody just like out of hand rejects, cloud. Yeah. And that really was like the big objection we faced. And we stuck to our guns and again, decided that this is where the puck was going. And we ended up being right about that. On mobile, we realized pretty early on that we needed to build mobile versions of our product. And specifically for, iOS and then Android. I would say that the mistake that we made was that mobile was one of about 5 major product initiatives that we were doing at that time. Again, this is like the 2009 to 2012 timeframe. And in hindsight, we probably should have had even more urgency around it. And instead of making it one of 5, we should have I should have, as the CEO, just said that, like, guys, drop everything. We're not doing anything else until we get mobile right.
Yeah.
And
what could you have looked at back then to have made that decision to go all in on mobile?
Just again, like there's no data that's going to give it to you. Maybe you could look at like the adoption curve of the iPhone, but it's more about just like knowing, again, skating to where the puck is going and knowing, and I think that you can't fully rely on data in these situations. I mean, that's one of the things about startups that's really important, is because if you wait until the data makes a decision irrefutable, if you wait till the writing is already on the wall, then like you've missed it, because everyone else who was a believer started working on it 2 years before you, and they're like way ahead of you. So this, a lot of this game is about understanding where the technology is going and where it wants to go, and not waiting for the adoption cycle to fully prove it out,
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of be willing to take those chances.
One of the things you said that I found really interesting is that CEOs have a lot more agency than they think, especially at tech companies.
Yeah.
And I imagine somewhere deep in your bones, you felt that mobile was the future, but maybe back then you felt you didn't have the agency to push the company in that direction. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think it was an agency problem. I think it was just there were lots of other really pressing things to work on. So, for example, we had by that point, we had a large sales team that had a list of features they needed to close the next big deal. We, we needed to expand the capabilities of our core product. And at that time, it was mostly being consumed on the web,
Yeah.
So
So
I
both
think
of those things are
Mhm.
true of a lot of companies right now that have zero AI in their products, where the CEO and a lot of engineers are saying, this is amazing.
Right.
And so if companies are to go and infuse AI into their products, they're going to need to bulldoze those things. What would you advise a CEO in that kind of position to do?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So the common denominator here is there is a lot of inertia in companies, even startups.
Yeah.
And one thing I've been amazed by is how early in a startup's life the innovator's dilemma kind of kicks in, where, this is supposed to this is a Clayton Christensen theory, that the reason why big companies miss innovation is because they're afraid it's going to cannibalize their core product. So they don't want to do it because like they've got a mature product that's spitting off billions of dollars, and the last thing they want to do is like undermine that and cannibalize that. But the tragedy is that if they don't do it, someone else will do it. They're going to eat their lunch. So the thing I've seen that's pretty amazing with startups is just that very early on, innovator's dilemma kicks in, or you could call it the problem of legacy, which is you have all of these plans and priorities that get set, and people don't want to change them because, for good reasons, like you don't want to thrash the team. I mean, if you're constantly changing the priorities, then the team goes crazy because you're thrashing.
Yeah.
So, or you set like a budget that you prepared for the board back in December, and now it's like April and you realize something different, but you somehow feel beholden to that old plan or whatever. And I just think that legacy is just like death for startups. I think you have to be willing to pivot on a dime and be willing to change in light of new realities, new realizations, because the big advantage that a startup has over that giant company is that you're not bound by, you shouldn't be bound by that innovator's dilemma. I mean, that big company has something to protect, right? They've got that $1 billion cash cow product that they're trying to protect. Startups usually don't have anything to protect. I mean, the default state for a startup is to run out of money and die. So I always say that like startup founders should be all in on their best idea. Don't compromise on that. And if that means changing the product roadmap from what you said it was going to be a month ago, like change it, So yeah, and that's what I mean by agency. You as the founder have the power or the agency to change almost anything in your company that you don't like. And what I hear from founders is all these like reasons or like frankly excuses for why they
What
can't
other kind
do
of
that.
reasons do you hear?
Well, it's like you hear this a lot around like headcount reductions, right? No one wants to do headcount reductions because it's unpleasant. But it was like, well, if we do this, then we'll get bad PR, or you don't hear that anymore because like every company's doing it. So it's not, but that was like a real thing is,
Yeah.
okay, if we do a headcount reduction, we won't be the hot company anymore. No one will want to come work here. So like perceptual reasons can be like, I think a big mistake is people are just worrying too much about what people outside the company are going to think, or it's just the inertia behind all of the current initiatives inside the company. Or again, trying to please a board, which is like super misguided, because the board should just be your partner. They're not, like we always say, like as a VC that sits on founder boards, we're not like your judge. We're not, you know what I mean? We're here to be your partner.
Yeah.
Like, let's figure out the biggest problems together. Like if, you tell me, you missed the plan or need to change the plan, it's like, okay, like why did that happen? Let's figure this out together. It's not like, oh, you bad founder, it's like, that's not what we're there to do.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about AI is it seems like if you're a SaaS company, AI helps you solve the same problems for customers even better. So even if they're not asking for it today, you can bet that every single day within your customers, some other competitor is coming up and pitching them a solution that does what you're doing, but way smoother and faster, and that they would be open to AI. Another blocker I see though is, I've heard from some people who say, well, no company is ever going to be comfortable sending their data, to some AI model and having it be used in some AI model. And, to be clear, a lot of AI models don't actually do that. But that feels to me like back in 2008, if you were to say, oh, the cloud violates every big company's IT policy, it's never going to be adopted.
These things always get worked out if the value is there. Security is always an issue, but again, it gets figured out. The question is whether the capabilities are there to deliver the value that justifies figuring it out. And in my view, the value always wins. So yeah, just back to AI, I think AI is going to be a lot like mobile, in the sense that there's a whole bunch of there were a whole bunch of pre-mobile SaaS companies. And when mobile came along, they either made the adaptation and like it turbocharged their business, or they couldn't figure it out and they fell by the wayside. And I think AI is going to be a lot like that, where you either figure it out and it turbocharges the business because you're able to just do so much more for customers, or you don't figure it out and then somebody else does, and then you're left behind. So I think it's critical. And the reason I say that is not because of the hype, but just because of the demos that I've seen. I've seen so many cool demos of products already where people are incorporating AI, and like, it's amazing. It's like what customers can do with your product just gets so much better. You can deliver so much more value. And so we're right now we're just talking about like the application layer, companies that may not be AI companies per se, but rather using APIs from, OpenAI or Anthropic, or, there's a whole bunch of these companies now that have sprouted up to provide the capabilities of large language models to applications. So just at the application layer, there's so much cool stuff you can do that I kind of think if you're not thinking about that and how to incorporate those capabilities, your product's just going to be less compelling than somebody else's.
Yeah. So final question. I think consumers have already won and will win from AI. But if you look at the landscape of companies out there, who gets more power? Who wins because of AI? Is it the big companies, the small companies, US companies? What do you think?
It's really hard to know like where the value capture is going to be. So at this early stage, what I would say is that probably there'll be to some degree all the above. I mean, if you think about mobile, one of the biggest winners for mobile was Facebook, because remember, like people used to just use Facebook on the web. And I mean, I'm dating myself here, but there was a time where like the only way you use Facebook was going to facebook.com, and it was like this giant website. Meaning like lots of tabs everywhere, and then they figured out how to streamline it and just put it in a mobile app. And even though, or because it was so streamlined, people just started using it more. And so it like actually turbocharged their business model, because people started using Facebook so much more in the nooks and crannies of their time. And that, I mean, that's true for like all the social networking sites. So I think there's going to be that dynamic where clearly the big companies that have these AI capabilities, they're going to benefit, but then also startups are going to benefit from being able to include, again, all these capabilities. And I think there's going to be a lot of SaaS startups whose products were more, let's say you would call them vitamins, not painkillers, maybe like the products were useful, but not strictly required. But with the addition of AI, kind of get pushed over to the top to now where it's like, wow, this is so cool. This is so good. It delivers so much value that like it's going to turbocharge their adoption. So I think we're going to see that. I mean, just like some of the examples I've seen already, like Copilot functionality, where it's like having a power user sitting next to you in the app, like helping you do things, because you can just talk to it in natural language. You know, I've seen, for example, demos where using an Excel spreadsheet, it's like you just tell it, hey, give me a formula that does this. You know, only a power user would know how to write that formula, because it's literally like writing code. But now a novice can do it because you just describe what you want in natural language. And there's like a zillion examples like that where you can just kind of tell the software what you want it to do and it'll do it for you, you know, or what you guys, I think, are working on with Copilot, where it'll actually like write code for you, just describe what you want. You just talk to it basically.
Yeah.
And it spits out the code that you're looking for, like highly technical code. It's a huge time saver. I mean, another way of describing this, I call it autocomplete for anything, where you can just start something. You could start writing an essay. You could start writing a piece of software. You could, you know, start working on a design for a website, and then you just tell the AI, complete this for me, you know, or you start working on a blog post.
Yeah.
And you write the title in the first paragraph and just like autocomplete it. Boom. You're like, whoa. Yeah. And then, you know, and then you can do human selection on it. You can actually say, give me 5 different versions. And then you click the one that you like the best. And then you're like, okay, now take that, give me 5 iterations on that, and just click through 5 generations of human selection. And you can evolve the thing that you're working on to be exactly what you want. Like this is just like scratching the surface, right? And then, you know, the AI gets the benefit of reinforcement learning through that. So next time it's even better. There's so many things, and that's the kind of stuff you can just do today, right? So, you know, it's, you know, it's, you know, the old cliche in the industry is that we overestimate what you can do in 1 year and underestimate what you can do in 10. We're already seeing these capabilities exist today. I mean, when you think about where it's going to go in 5 years or 10 years, as the AI gets even better, you know, and the cycles now, the GPT went from what, 3.5 version 3.5 to 4.0 in like 6 months. And
everything is moving faster. It feels like,
yeah, it's moving even faster. And now you're gonna be able to write code using the AI to make the AI better. I mean, it's like bonkers. But I mean, I think like where it's all going is this is one example, is imagine a Copilot for the CEO, where every single business interaction in the company, every meeting that's like, you know, on Zoom, or every email now, you know, gets you know, sent to the AI as like training data. And the CEO can just ask it questions. Now there's some privacy things to work out, because that's why I say like the CEO, because CEO generally has access to everything. But like you ask the CEO, like, hey, what are my competitors working on that I'm not thinking about? Or like what's the biggest problem that we're hearing from customers right now, or the top 5? Like look at customer support, and just like being able to get answers like that. Or like look at every interaction that our salespeople are having. What are the top 5 objections we get that we're not able to answer, or whatever. This is like stuff you can do today, really.
If you can pull all the data in one place. But one of the interesting things is that data lives in, 50, 100 different tools today. And some companies say, well, we're going to be the one tool that companies need to use, the ultimate suite. And then we'll be able to train and run AI based on all the data that we have. And other companies are saying, well, we're going to integrate, we're going to connect all the data from all these best of breed tools that you can keep using. And so, it again comes back to this suite versus point solution. And I think that, for us at Sourcegraph, we see dev teams using 70 different tools and all kinds of things to deploy and monitor and observe. And if you want to ask questions like, where's the code that's causing this error in production right now? Well, that alone needs 3 or 4 different tools. And so, we're betting on this world where there's gonna be a lot of independent tools, and there's gonna be a lot more choice, a lot more dynamism, even a lot more tools built in-house, because it's so much easier for anyone to build tools.
Right. Yeah. I think there's going to be a proliferation. It's not just going to be like one AI that controls everything. And that's because I think partly because the AI models need to be trained. And so models that are developed for a specific purpose are going to be better for that purpose than some other sort of generic model. So I think you're going to see a proliferation of different models and applications. And it's not just going to be one thing. But I do expect, though, that, this isn't just given the capabilities we're already seeing with conversational AI, like that the AI understands human conversations so well. I do think that, and again, there's privacy issues to work out here, but I think like but I do think a substantial portion of our business meetings and communications will be captured somehow. And you already see this with like customer support, like call centers, where they tell you they're going to record the call for quality assurance. That's definitely getting fed into the AI, and the AI will just tell you who's doing a good job and who's not, and like what the big problems are and where the company could do better. Same thing with sales, right? There's going to be, you've got like Gong and Chorus, they're already recording sales calls for quality assurance purposes. The AI is definitely going to like be involved in that. So it's going to be really, so there's already a substantial amount of this data that exists. And, but there wasn't a lot to do with this data. Like in reality, like no one's got the time to go through like all these recorded calls and, or the transcripts for those calls. Like no human could ever like know what to do with those things. But
the AI previously was used to build new power user features, but now the AI is going to be used to make features that every single user can use, and might be the only feature, the only way to use it, which is a huge change.
Yeah. So crazy stuff. A lot of interesting things coming, and we're just at the very, very beginning of this cycle. So I think it's really exciting what we're seeing.
Yeah, same here. It's a crazy new world, and it's awesome that it's moving so fast. Well,
yeah, totally.
Thanks, David, for chatting about this, and thanks for being a big Sourcegraph supporter.
Yeah, and I'm excited for what you guys are coming out with. So I think it's gonna be amazing. So
yeah, same here.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Quinn. Appreciate it.
Cool.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Beyang. I'm the CTO and co-founder here at Sourcegraph, and I'm here to close out the run of show here. I want to thank... Actually, wait a second. I feel like there was something we left out. Oh, yeah. So some of you may have seen a really snazzy demo video that was released yesterday by another very large software company demoing using AI for the purposes of coding. And we saw that video just like everyone else. We were very impressed with it. But then we thought, wait a second, we have a bit more than a demo video. In fact, we have a fully functioning product that kind of works better than everything that you saw in the video. So we call ours Sourcegraph Cody, Sourcegraph Cody. And I guess long story short, we ended up making our own video. So could we play that video? All right, so that was the video that we threw together very late last night, just taking a couple screen grabs of the product. If people want to share that on social media, I think we just tweeted it out as well. Would appreciate your all's help in getting the word out. And if you want access to Cody, come join our Discord. Justin, I think we'll drop a link to that. We're trying to onboard people as quickly as we can. We're, again, a startup, small company. We're kind of scrambling here, but we think the product's amazing. We want to get in people's hands, and just keep building and iterating out in the open as much as we can. So thank you all for joining today. I want to say thank you especially to our community members, our loyal users, and our fantastic customers. It's really a privilege to serve you. We've launched a bunch of cool new things today at Starship 5, but we're still working hard. We got a lot more things to come, a lot more interesting and exciting things in the hopper, and hope you'll stay in touch and join us for the next live stream. All right.